Hey everybody, welcome to Series 2, Creating More Sophisticated Dialogues with the Dialog Editor. I'll quickly go through the agenda. We're going to cover two pretty common scenarios that you'll encounter. The first is, I sort of alluded to this in the first video as well, but this is something that I think will be very common, and that is disabling the OK button when the destination list box is empty. So in many cases, you'll have a statistics command where you're going to have variables you want to analyze, and obviously if the dialog comes up and no one selected any variable for analysis, you want to have the OK button on that dialog disabled. The other is that of a radio button control, and I want to show you how you can create a radio button controls where when you click on a radio button, you want a certain text box to be enabled. For instance, the radio button is confidence interval, and when that radio button is clicked, you want a text box to become enabled so a user can enter the confidence interval value. So we've got that as well. So I'll start off with the first, which is probably the most common use case, and that is, or scenario, and that is, you've got a dialog like the one sample t-test that I covered in series 1, and when you haven't got any variables for analysis, you want the OK button disabled. So there you see the destination list box is empty, the OK button is enabled, the destination list box is now populated, and you want the OK button enabled. Okay, in the prior screen it was disabled. In this screen it is enabled because now there's a variable available for analysis. So I just want to cover some really basic information on properties and controls. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but I'll just go over it really quickly. So in the Dialog Editor application, you click on a control. That control gets dropped on the canvas. It is now part of your dialog. And you see on the one sample t-test, I have several controls, one for the source variables, one for the target or destination variables, one to capture one radio group button to capture the alternative hypothesis, a text box to capture the confidence interval, a text box to capture the null hypothesis. And when you click on a control, here you see the destination variable list is selected, and I see that because I have these little handles at the edges of the list box, and whenever a control is selected, I see all the properties for those controls on the right hand side. So I have controls and I have properties of the selected control on the right hand side. And when I talk about creating rules, at a very basic level, what rules allow you to do is set a property on one or more target controls based on a change in a property on the one source control that is selected. Okay, and again, the source and target can be the same controls. So I'll show you more about that in the next few slides. So two properties I want to focus on. The first is the can execute property. And the can execute property is available on all controls except labels and the move button control. The OK button on a dialog is enabled only when every control on that dialog has can execute set to true. If there's one or more controls that has can execute property set to false, the OK button will be disabled. I also want to introduce the items count property. The items count property is a property available on list controls, for example, the source variable list control, the destination variable list control, and its value is automatically set to the number of items in the control. Okay, it's not something you can set. Okay, it is automatically set by the BlueSky application. So really quickly, I want to show you these two properties. There's the can execute property, that's the item count property. You see the can execute, the items count property is grayed out. You cannot enter that value. Its value is automatically set based on the number of items in that control. All right. So basically, we're going to set two rules. We're going to make can execute to false when the destination variable list is empty, or items count is 0. That's when it's empty. And we can make can execute true when the destination variable has one or more items. That is, items count is greater than 0, and this enables the OK button. So let's jump on to the demo section. I'm going to go ahead and open up the one sample t-test dialog that we created. And here I have the Okay, let me get it from here. I have the dialog. I'll open it, and I'll just show you what we're going to create before we create it. Right, so what I want is right now the OK button is disabled, the OK button is enabled. I'm just previewing the dialog. I move it out of there, the OK button becomes disabled again. Okay, so let's do it again. It's enabled. I move it out, it's disabled. That's what we're trying to do. So what I'm going to do is, just to illustrate, I'm going to delete this control, okay, and add it back again. All right. There we go. I'm going to use the handles to resize it, make it a little smaller. Okay. And what I'm going to do is set the filter, so I can only set scale variables. So the filter allows me to select what types of variables I'm going to allow in that destination variable list row. So I don't want ordinal, I don't want normal, I don't want date, I don't want string. So I set that. Okay, if you look carefully at the filter control, you can also say you want nominal variables with 2 levels, with 3 levels. So you can really restrict the variables that get displayed in the destination variable list control. So there's a lot of sophistication built into this tool. All right. So now I'm going to give it a name, because I got to give every control a name. I'm going to call it tvar variable box 1, just like I did before. And I'm gonna now go into define rules. Okay, now remember, the destination variable list is controlled, control is selected, and when I go to define rules, I now have the ability to trigger a rule based on a change in any one of these properties here. Okay, so I'm gonna add the rule, and the condition where the rule gets triggered is items count, and I can look at my property name here on the right hand side. I can say items count equals 0. Okay, so if item counts equals 0, what property do I want to set? Obviously the property I want to set is can execute, and I want to set can execute on this very same control. So what I'm saying is if item counts equal to 0, set can execute equals to false. Okay, so this can execute is on this control tvar box 1, and the property name is can execute. Okay, and I can say false. All right, now I'm gonna add another rule, and I'm gonna say I want to trigger this rule based on item counts again. And I say item count greater than 0, and when item counts greater than 0, I want to set can execute on the same control to true. So I look at give it a control name tvar box 1. Now I could set any control, any property on any control in this, so it doesn't have to be tvar box 1. Okay, it can be any control, and I give it a property name that I want to set as can execute, and I save it a value of true. Okay, all right. Now there's one more thing, there's one mistake I've made intentionally. All right, and I will make the mistake, I'll show you the problem, and then I'll correct it. So what we'll go and do now is we'll go and preview this, or actually can execute. Yes, I have made the mistake. Okay, and you see that the variable list is empty. However, the OK button is enabled. Okay, I don't want that. In order to prevent that from happening, I will set the default setting of can execute to false. All right. So when the dialog is first displayed, it'll look at can execute. Since can execute on this control is set to false, it'll disable it. However, as soon as I add something to it, the rule gets triggered and can execute is set to true. When I remove something from it, the rule gets triggered and can execute is set to false. All right, so that's what I wanted to show you. Remember, the rules are set in define rules. And when you define a rule, you set your condition, then you go into setters and you set the property and you select the control and the property on the control that you want to change the value of. Okay, so very simple. All right, so we've gone through that, and I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and talk about the second part, which is creating a group of radio buttons where one or more radio buttons is associated with a text box. Okay, so let's go and take a look at a simple radio button first before we go and set up a radio button which is associated with a text box. And in this dialog, which is our same one sample t-test dialog, you see a radio button right here. Okay, not a radio button, a group radio button. It's not just a radio button, it's a group radio button with several radio buttons on it. Okay, however, if I want to create a group radio button that looks like this, where I have one of the radio buttons wired to a text box, so that when this confidence level is enabled, I can enter a value in that text box, and when another radio button is enabled, I want this text box disabled if it's enabled, right? And I'll show you how this looks like in a moment. Okay, so now let's I'm just showing you how these radio buttons map to the syntax or the controls or the or populate the parameters of the syntax with the arrows. All right, so now let's jump into the demo. So I said this is a very straightforward radio button, and I'll show you how to create it. I'll just delete it and I'll create it again. All right, so I'll click on the group radio button or the radio group, which is right here. I'll drag and drop it to the area of my screen that I'm interested in. Okay, I'll size it. I'll give it the header text I will change to alternate hypothesis. Okay, I'll give it a unique name because every control needs to have a unique name. I'll steal the name from the syntax here, gpbox2. Okay, and then I'll add the radio buttons to it, right? So the first one I'll call RD1, and I'll give it a caption of population new, and I'll set the default state as selected. Create another radio button, and I'll give it a label of population mean okay, and I'm basically clicking the tab to get the new row. Okay, so clicking the tab gives you at the end you click 3 tabs, and on once it reaches the end of the line on the 3rd tab you get a new row, and I will say population mean is smaller than MU. Okay, and I will click OK, and there you see I get my radio group. I have to size it a little bit just to show you what it looks like, and I'm pretty much set to go, right? Obviously I need to click on each of these and set the syntax, right, because I'm going to parameterize what gets passed. So I want, when the first radio button is selected, I want two-sided. And you can look at Series 1. Series 1 talks about how each of these controls within the radio group populate the parameter below. Okay, so that's all covered in Series 1. It's fairly straightforward. If the second radio button is selected, I want greater. And if the third radio button is selected, I want less. All right. And that was it. I've not formatted it correctly, but you can do that now. You'll know how to do that. But you basically see I've just created this radio group control. And the only disadvantage of this radio group control is this is not suited for me to add a text box, because the spacing of this control is very tight. I cannot space the radio buttons within this control at all. Okay. So now let's open up another dialog. I don't want to really save the changes, and that is plot of means. Okay, very neat capability. You will find this under the graphics top level menu item in the BlueSky Statistics application. You can go ahead and play with it, but I'm just going to show you this error bars control right now. So I'm going to preview. All right, and here on the error bars control, you can see that if I pick up the standard errors, I don't really need to enter a confidence interval. If I pick up standard deviations, I don't need to enter confidence interval. However, if I want my confidence interval displayed in a bar format in the graph, I want the user to specify a confidence interval. Right. At the same time, now if the user says, oh, you know what, I don't want to do a confidence interval, and I select no error bars, I want that text control blanked out, and I want any entry I entered there blanked out, because I'm not going to display the 95% confident intervals. Right. At the same time, if I click on this, I don't want it checked. If I click on this, I don't want the text box enabled. But when I click on this, I want the text box enabled. And not only that, when I click on something else, I want the text box disabled as well as the value removed. Okay, so let us go ahead and create such a group box. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete what I have on the screen, and we're going to lay it out. All right. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're not going to click on radio group, but we're going to click on group box. Okay, so I'm going to get the group box and move it to the place I want to put it. I'm going to give it a unique name. Okay, I'll call it group box 1 test. All right, and I'm going to put some radio buttons on the group box. Now this is important. Okay, the name of the group box is important because all the radio buttons that you place on this group box need to be part of this group. All right, so let's not forget the name group box 1 test. So I put the first radio button in. Let us call it standard errors. So let's give it a name of stderr, and when it's selected, we want the parameter se to be passed, and let's give it a text of standard errors. Alrighty. Let's click on the next radio button and let's give it a name of standard stddev, and let's give it a text of standard deviations. Okay, now what's important is that we give both these radio buttons, and I forgot to give the first radio button a group name, but I want this group name here to be set to this group box. Okay, in fact we can just change the header text associated with the group box to error bars. Okay, what's most important is this grp1 test. We want to make sure that the group name here is grp1 test and the group name here is grp1 test. Okay, let's click on the radio button one more time. Okay, drag and drop it here, and we give it a name of confidence interval. Okay, I'm looking here. Conf interval was the unique name I selected. We'll give it a text of confidence interval. Okay, the group name, as I said before, is grp1 test. Let me double check that by clicking on the group box. It's group box 1 test. Group box 1 test. Let me size this appropriately, and when it is checked, I don't want or when it is checked, I want conf let me see, I believe when it is checked, I don't want anything to be passed. We can verify that, okay, later. And now I want to add my text box, all right, to capture the confidence interval. And I will give it a name of conf level, and I now recall what I want passed here is conf okay. Alright, so I've given it a unique name. Now one thing I forgot is I want the default for this dialog when it's displayed the first time is to have it selected. So I'll set is selected to true. Okay, so the is selected just gives me the state of the radio button, is it true or false. So I've got my confidence interval where I can enter my confidence interval. I want to give it a default value of 0.95, so I'll enter that there. And what's important is the first time this dialog displays, since the standard errors radio button is checked, I want the enable property to be set to false. Okay, so the first time this dialog displays, the text box will be disabled. All right, I want to add one more radio button to capture the no error bars parameter. Okay, and it's no error bars. Okay, I give it a unique name and I call it no error bars, and you'll see the caption appear here. As soon as I type in the text, when I put in the text basically gives the radio button a caption. So the text property is associated with the caption associated with the radio button. I give my group 1. Okay, I can't remember grp1. Okay, give me a second. I just want to make sure. Okay, the group name needs to be grp box 1 test. Okay, so the group name is grp box 1 test. Let me verify that the group name on every radio button is correct. grp box 1 test. I'm going to go to grp box 1 test. That has the right radio button. So I will come back to this text box control, but I've got no error bars, and I want the group name to be grp box 1 test. Okay, so the group name links all these radio buttons together so that when you select one, the other one automatically gets deselected, right? That's how I know that all these 4 radio buttons are part of one group, and the name of the group grp1 test links all these radio buttons automatically. All right, so now I'm going to click on the text box. In terms of how the text gets substituted in the command below, conf interval, this is what the value will get substituted here, and I want the text as is. Okay, so I'm not going to be too worried about that, and that's pretty much it. Okay, for now, and now we can think about we'll move on to defining the rules. All right, so now I'm going to click on this radio button, and I want to define a rule that if the is selected property is set to true, I want to make sure that this text box is disabled. All right, so before we set the rule, let's go ahead and save and preview this dialog. Okay, and now when you take a look at it, you see that standard errors is checked. I select standard deviation. Obviously it's still disabled. So it's not working as I expected to. But what is definitely working is the first time I come to the dialog, my text box is disabled, which I am fine with. Okay, so another thing we don't want to do is we don't want to set the default value, because that can look confusing when nobody selected it. Okay, but what we may want to do is as soon as someone clicks on the confidence interval, we may want to make this 0.95, and I'll show you how to do this. All right, so the first thing we want to do is if we want to set a rule so that if this radio button is selected, we disable this text box control, right? And we blank it out as well. So I'll go into define rules, and what I'll say is property name that we're interested in is oops, I think I've selected the wrong control. So I go to this radio button, and I go into define rules, and what I want to say is if selected is equal to true, we're going to disable the text box, because when they've selected standard errors, we don't want them entering a confidence interval, right? We want to disable that text box. So I will go and I will say the property name is selected with this control. Okay, so is selected equals true. What we want to do is then make the enabled property on the text box false. So I've forgotten the name of the text box, so I'll come here, and the text box name is conf level, right? So what we will go is we'll go back into the rules, and we'll say is selected equals true, and we will make the enabled property on conf level to false. So the enabled property controls whether controls tells you whether a control is enabled or disabled. So what we want to do is, if selected, if the first radio button is selected, we want to make sure that the conf level text box is disabled. Okay, and we want to set another rule that says if the first radio button is selected, that is selected equals true, we want to blank out any text or any confidence interval that somebody else has entered, that the person using it has entered before. Okay, and we just blank it out. All right, now we have to do the same rule on all these three radio buttons. Okay, because when it's selected, we want to disable this control and we want to blank out this value. So we have to repeat the same rule on all the three other radio group controls. All right, so I'll add, so for this other radio button, if it is selected, so if it's selected, I want it disabled. I want another rule that says if this is selected equals true, I want the text property of that text box set to blank. Okay, so I have two rules here. Now here's the only case if the confidence level is enabled, then I want to set the then I want to make this text box enabled, right? So now if this confidence interval radio button is selected, you can have the control name conf level, property name enabled, and true. Okay, I'll just make the true. Okay, and then another one that says property name text equals, I'm sorry, is equals true. I want to set the text property of the conf level text box. This is the text box. I want to set the text property to 0.95. Okay, and the error bars, when error bars are selected, we want to disable the conf level text box control. So I'll set that last rule. Equals okay, and I can set the control false. Okay, and I say So if it's selected, I want to blank out the text in the radio button, in the text box control. Oops, sorry, we did that already. Text. Leave it empty. Okay, so that should do it, and that should give you exactly what you're looking for. And I wouldn't be surprised if we made a couple of typos. That does happen. We'll check it out. Okay, so great. The first time it displays confidence interval is disabled. Now, as soon as I click this, I should have had this confidence interval control enabled. That didn't happen, and we'll look at why. So as soon as I have click confidence interval, we have it enabled. And when I click no error bars, it does get disabled. Okay, so let's take a look again. Let's see which rules are not firing off. If I click standard errors, great, confidence interval is disabled. When I click standard deviation, confidence interval is disabled. When I click confidence interval itself, it gets the right value. Now what happens when I click standard deviation? Yes, it gets disabled and the value gets blanked out. When I click standard errors, again, it gets disabled. Okay, so let me just cancel and check one more time to be sure. Just want to make sure. All right, so the first time it comes up, I want confidence interval disabled because standard errors is selected. I click on standard deviations, perfect, it's still disabled. I click on confidence interval, the text box control gets enabled so I can enter a value. And now for some reason, if I select I don't want confidence interval and I select error bars, that value goes away. So that's exactly what I intended to do. So with that, let's go back in and summarize. So we've discussed rules, we've discussed radio group controls. For your reference, the one sample t-test, plot of means dialog, as well as the one sample t-test dialogs are available under sample dialogs. And we also encourage you to review the following videos, series 3, creating reusable dialogues for an R data manipulation command. We would like you to also see series 4, creating a reusable dialog with graphical output. Series 5, creating a command without a dialog with tabular output, and Series 6, creating reusable dialog and tabular output for complex R statistical function, which involves both tabular output and graphical output. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and do not hesitate to email us at support@blueskystatistics.com with any questions or comments. Once again, don't hesitate to reach us at support, SUPPORT, @BlueSky Statistics. That's BLUESKY Statistics, STATISTICS.com. Okay, so support@blueskystatistics.com. Thank you for taking the time.